Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining this session this afternoon. Today is April 11th, and we have a very special topic today, which is can prenups prevent domestic violence? A very tough topic, and there could be different kind of opinions, but we are very delighted to welcome our special guest speaker, Reshma Sambare and Jayshree Nagraj. Welcome, Reshma. Welcome, Jayshree.
Thank you. Hello, Pramila.
Yeah, hi, Reshma. So without much ado, we would like to begin with, Reshma, do you want to introduce yourself and go over as to what is a prenuptial agreement? What can be included? How can this prevent domestic violence? What are pros and cons? What is post prenup? And apologize, it's a long list of asks,
Mhm.
but if you could share something about yourself and about this very special topic.
Yeah, thank you, Pramila. Thanks for having me and inviting me to speak today. Nice to meet you all, whoever is watching this today or listening to it. Appreciate you taking time from your Sunday afternoon to attend the discussion on this important topic. As you heard, Pramila had a long list for me to cover, and she's only given me 15 minutes, so that's very unfair. But I'm going to try my best to see how we can cover the highlights. Without much suspense, I want to first give you a really short answer to this question. Can prenups prevent domestic violence? Can it stop domestic violence? The answer is no, right? Absolutely no, not. Um, uh, but does that mean you shouldn't enter into prenup? No, right? That those two are completely separate questions that you can analyze separately and reach different conclusions. But the question that I'm about to answer today is: can prenups prevent domestic violence? No, absolutely not. Unfortunately. So let's talk about what is a prenup agreement. It's also called as an antenuptial or prenuptial, right? It's also called as premarital agreement in different states. They all mean the same thing. It's just a type of agreement that parties would enter into before marriage, right? Before marriage. So that's the one condition that has to be met. Is it's generally entered into before marriage. There are also postnuptial agreements that can look exactly similar as prenuptial. They have the same laws that govern those agreements, and those are simply entered into after marriage. But generally, the conditions are slightly different. You know, parties may not be getting along, and now they are seeing on the horizon that maybe they are heading toward divorce. So they may think about entering into such an agreement so that they save on this legal process when they actually file for divorce and they have to go through property division. So those are looked at slightly differently by courts than prenuptial, where it's you don't have the bonds of marriage, you don't have this legally binding relationship rather of a marriage, but you are freely at your own will without any force or coercion entering into an agreement. So those are looked at a lot differently by courts than say postnuptial agreements. So as I said, it's just a written contract between two people. Generally, these prenuptial agreements talk about possession of assets. They talk about treatment of future earnings by each spouse. They talk about control of the property of each spouse, that they may inherit, that they may get it as a gift, that they may acquire, that they may have acquired prior to their marriage or post their marriage, and how those should be treated. And then, of course, the potential division of the property, because that's what this agreement is really getting into. But again, I don't want to give this misconception that prenuptials are only really used in divorce matters, because they can also be a really good tool for if your spouse dies, and then this estate planning matter. So you can also use this as a really good tool for estate planning. Well, if particularly if your spouse was married before and if they had kids from prior marriage, so you may have to deal with a lot more participants in his estate, and I'm going to say his because just to make it easier. A victim I would refer to as her and abuser as his, just for the sake of our discussion. So that can also be used as a really good estate planning tool, right? So that's another reason you can think about prenuptial agreements, other than just the divorce uh, uh, or the domestic violence matters, right? It's also can be after death as a estate planning tool. So it's generally fairly common. There are a lot of myths about prenuptial agreements, like it's only for rich people, wealthy people, that the courts don't enforce these, um, that that I'm not, we are not in love if you're talking about prenuptial agreements, but nothing like that. These are all myths. You can be very much in love and still talk very objectively about your future earnings, because particularly as we move forward and more and more women are have either equal or even more earnings than their male spouses. So it should be very commonly thought about that should we enter into prenuptial agreement, just so that you both are feeling financially secure as you take your vows and enter into this relationship, so that you don't feel controlled by another spouse. So generally, though, until now, I mean, there is still a fair conception that if parties have substantial assets, if they have kids from their prior marriages, or if they have, or if they have, or if they're expecting to get large inheritances, or if they have very high incomes or multiple businesses that are jointly owned by spouses, family members, or others, then those could be very typical circumstances where prenuptial agreements are entered into. But as I said, anybody can think about those. They're not reserved for these profile of people. There are also wedding contracts. A lot of people generally ask, what's the difference between a wedding contract and a prenup? The purpose of a wedding contract is very different. It's generally to determine how the wedding related costs or debts will be divided if the engagement is called off, right? So you get engaged and then months pass by and the wedding is called off and you've incurred all these costs. So that's when wedding contract comes in handy. But those are not prenuptial agreements. Those are completely different. Okay. Plus, prenuptial agreements are effective only if wedding actually occurs, right? So you enter into an agreement and it does not, maybe you can enter into a prenuptial agreement 2 years before you get married because you're getting engaged and 2 years later you're going to get married. You can enter into a prenup agreement 2 years prior to getting married, but it will not have any effect legally until after you get married. So that's an important differentiation. You have to get married for it to become effective. Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you so much,
the
Reshma.
next one.
Yeah.
Yeah, Pramila, do you want me to continue on this
Yeah, so
or?
I think I just quickly also wanted to introduce Jayashree. Jayashree, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself and your quick thoughts, and then Reshma can also share, the legality of these topics.
Okay, hi, I'm Jayashree Nagraj. I live in Aurora with my daughter. I've been divorced for 6 years now, and in the process, I was left with no finances. He did not pay the alimony and child support. And this is the reason why this topic prenups interests me because I don't want anybody else to go through this. I had to, I was not allowed to work and then I was not left with any finances. So basically, I was destroyed. But it's not just me or about me. It's I see a lot of women going through this, women who have been in marriages for like 4 decades too. Like they have grandkids and everything, but then they were left with no money in the divorce. So I think that a prenup agreement where it is very well defined financial distribution post if the divorce happens, then that could really protect both the parties in the divorce. I don't see a reason why one would not want to sign a prenup if it's going to protect everybody. That's my thought about a prenup.
Yeah, that's good. So Pramila, do you want me to just pick that point up
Yes,
or
please.
continue on more
Yeah, if you can speak,
legalities?
yeah, if you can speak on Jayashree's point and then kindly continue.
Okay, sure. So yeah, I think Yashri brings up a good point. As I said, Prenups are not reserved for a certain profile of people. All couples can think of that for their financial protection for sure. But as we will see later on, pros and cons of prenups. Generally, when there is an imbalance of wealth, is the person with higher wealth or the larger assets is more concerned about protecting it. And I've been working in the field of domestic violence for probably 23 years now. And at least in my past 23 years, which is not that long, but still 23 years, I have seen very, very rare instances of a victim of substantial assets continuing in an abusive relationship. Because generally then they are more empowered to leave the abuser, fight the expensive legal battles, and not lose their wealth. So generally what happens in prenups is that it's the person who ends up abusing generally has access to more wealth than the other spouse, and then the prenups get returned in their favor. And not always, or very few instances, that both parties are equally represented with proper legal counsel. So both parties may not understand their rights. So yes, I mean, getting into a prenup is a good idea, provided you have equally good, solid legal counsel, provided it's done fairly, provided you agree with those terms, and that it's in writing, you have witnesses, it's notarized, and all of that, right? Because if not, then it will only hurt you even more. Because the way I look at prenups is generally they're done and encouraged by a spouse with larger assets. And generally they do it because they're already of that, they don't want to lose that control over their property, because they're already thinking ahead that in case my behavior turns into a problem and the woman leaves me, then I don't have to share my assets with her in that case, right? So what happens in that case is they try to protect their assets in a prenup, and then it doesn't prevent them from behaving badly, because now they are committing abuse. Now they have this abusive behavior. You end up in a divorce, and then you don't get anything because of the prenup. And there are also many cases like that nationally that I can point to, where it has happened again and again, where a woman, she is like a very rich socially, and attending all these expensive parties and living in very expensive properties and driving very big cars, but the prenups are written in such a way that she never paid attention that the husband was buying all of this personal property in businesses' names. So what happens is that because the prenup protects that all of that property and keeps it out of your marital property, they get divorced and she gets nothing in that case. So these are very tricky situations. So should you be discouraged from entering into a one? No, you shouldn't be, provided they are done right. Yeah, so that's the answer. I would like to give some more legal background on the prenups as to what can parties achieve, right? So they can select and control a lot of their legal rights related to their property, related to what happens when one partner dies, or if there is a divorce, right? What rights you may have with respect to the partner's property who dies or gets divorced. And then you also have an opportunity to supersede a lot of the state law related to the marital properties, right? Because the state laws govern how the marital property should be divided, how the retirement benefits should be divided, the assets, debts, and liabilities, and right to seek alimony if you get divorced in a certain number of years. And then all of that can be superseded, overwritten by the terms of your prenuptial agreement. That's why they also are even more important, that you understand those terms and that you can foresee what may happen to you, so that you are protected by really good terms of the prenup, because it will be really difficult to invalidate that agreement at a later date if you didn't foresee something bad that could happen to you 10 years after you get married. The agreement can also set forth waivers of the surviving spouse, as we said, with respect to what happens to their estate. You can also manipulate your wills and trust through your prenup. It can also talk about your marital property and how to protect it in case one spouse files for bankruptcy, because the bankruptcy court can reach all of your assets. And then the prenup can protect you in that case also, in case of bankruptcy filing by one spouse. Of course, if you both file it, then it's not going to protect you. Some of the prenup agreements can also include escalator clause, meaning it says if you get divorced in first 3 years, you only get X amount of alimony. But if you get divorced in 10 years, then you get Y amount of alimony. So that's also very common to have the escalator clause in there. And then the most importantly, it can also have a clause that if the marriage reaches certain number of years, the agreement will no longer be enforceable. So that's also important. Like, if you are married for 25 years, you now really know each other well, and you don't have to distrust each other through XYZ terms. So some of the prenups include that kind of clause where it says after 20 years or 20, whatever number of years, it's not going to be enforceable.
In your practice, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
In your practice, because you work a lot with domestic abuse survivors and victims, have you come across anyone who had a prenuptial agreement and had to go through domestic abuse or domestic violence?
Yes, only twice in 23 years. Only twice. Most of the times, even when the victim was pretty wealthy, they hadn't thought about this because they trusted the other partner so much. So only twice in 23 years I came across prenup in a domestic violence situation. But in both the cases, in one case, it was the abuser who was very wealthy and he had protected all the assets. And in another case, it was the victim who thankfully was pretty wealthy, came from a wealthy family, and she had a lot of inherited property from her family. And so thankfully that was protected because when they got divorced because of the abuse, she didn't have to share that property with the abuser because of the prenup.
So I know just you also have one question, Reshma. So you've mentioned that mostly people who are, men and women who are from a rich background or who have a lot of inheritance go for prenuptial agreement to protect their assets. Is there a reason that, someone, again, I'm going to middle class or someone from other genres, are they not aware of this, or they don't want to pursue because they feel there's nothing to lose? Or nothing to gain, sorry, not lose.
Yeah, generally because what happens is we just don't think about it. Mostly it's the awareness, but also it's the social cultural stigma that's attached to prenups. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be. Now we are getting more and more aware. See, for the longest time, women didn't work. We didn't have as much earnings as the men did, so we didn't think about it. Well, that is changing now over the last decade, but it's still new. It's still a new phenomenon, believe it or not. Most of us are, but still a lot of majority of women are still not earning as much as men. And every day we learn that even those who are working next to men are earning 2/3 of the men, or 60 cents on a dollar that men make. So because of that, and because of this unnecessary social cultural stigma, they just don't think about it. They should, and it's younger generation is now becoming more aware, and they are thinking about it. But I would say my generation or older, and very rarely we thought about these things. Very rarely. I even know women who are sole bread earners, and this thought never even occurred to them that they should protect their assets from their spouses. So that's one. You would be surprised, since maybe some of the crowd here, maybe they're of Indian descent or South Asian descent, I don't know. But if they are in India, it's so rare that anybody thinks about a prenup. In fact, there is this common belief, even in the legal community, that most courts are going to not hold it enforceable. That's definitely not true. But that's the common belief in the legal community even, that prenups are not going to be held enforceable. In fact, there is not even one case yet in Indian courts where the court has been asked to enforce a prenup agreement because they're so rare. The only state I can think of is Goa, where they still follow Portuguese civil code, so under which prenups are legally enforceable. But I don't know if there are any cases yet. So, because generally, even if there is no separate law related to prenups, they can be covered under the Indian Contract Act. So, even in people, if they're getting married in India and coming here, they should, and if they want to get into a prenup, they still can, and it will be held valid by Indian courts. So it's just, again, a lot of myths surrounding it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Jashri, did you have a question before?
No, I'm like, so slowly introducing prenup or making it known to the younger generation could, to a
Mhm.
certain extent, help them formulate a good prenup so that can protect them. You think that is possible?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, but let's talk about protection separately again, right? Because as I said, it's a two-folded question. Is it a good idea to get into prenups to protect your financial assets? Yes, but protection from domestic violence is something different, and that, unfortunately, that answer from me is always going to be no. Yeah, the prenups have not. They don't have any teeth with respect to domestic violence, unfortunately, because it's just such a behavioral issue that unfortunately prenups can actually work against you in case of domestic violence, because then the abuser may be even more empowered. Hey, even if she fights for divorce, she's not going to get anything because of a prenup, right? Because now they have protected their financial assets through their company, businesses, whatever they inherited, because then the divorce is not going to override that. So it could even work the other way around, unfortunately. But anyway, we can come back to that. Let me just quickly continue on. I wanted to just quickly touch on some federal laws preempt, meaning they override what's in the prenup, right? Because some parties try to write about retirement benefits and pension benefits and ERISA, like Employee Retirement Income Security Act, whatever comes under that. And then these override the state laws, so they will also take priority over whatever you say in your prenup. May not be enforced if the retirement a plan or pension plan has something else written in it as a beneficiary. So that's something to remember. One other thing is immigrants. Maybe some of the crowd who's listening in have immigrant background, and if the spouse is sponsoring you, by filing an affidavit of support with the USCIS, they have to enter into this. It's like a 10-year contract they enter into with the US government as the sponsor. So, no matter what you say in the prenup, it's not going to be enforced by the court if you present to the court, hey, look, I came as an H4, I came as on a K1 as a fiance visa or whatever, and then the spouse sponsored me. Here is the I-864, the sponsorship form or affidavit form signed by my spouse, and that can be withheld. That can be enforced, and it will override your prenup. Okay, so if the prenup is unfavorable, you can always use this if you're an immigrant spouse. There are various state requirements with respect to how to make it more enforceable. So generally, they have to be in writing. Both parties have to be represented with separate legal counsel, because that's another common mistake. They try to save money and only go to one lawyer, and one lawyer cannot really advise two clients who are kind of adverse to each other during that situation. So you have to have separate counsel. Witnesses that are preferred, not required. Of course, it has to be signed, notarized, and then certain states have this requirement that you have to wait for at least 7 days after a prenup is first presented to you. Only certain states have that. Illinois doesn't, but certain other states in the US have that. And it's a good idea because they just want you to have this cooling off period so that you're not thinking from your emotions, right? So the courts are just wanting to make sure that you're not so taken away by your love for the other spouse that you're not thinking clearly what's in the prenup or not reading it and signing it, because it's a very common phenomena where people don't read it and just trust their spouse so much and just sign it, whatever is presented. It has happened a lot of times. Particularly with the state of Illinois, they are governed by the Illinois State's Uniform Premarital Agreement Act, which is very specific. It's a statutory, requirements are already laid out there. Again, it says it has to be in writing and signed by both parties, need to be witnessed, and you have to file that with your local county. So that's another thing that it's important. Don't just keep it to yourself. File it with the court or the local county. And again, it only becomes effective if you get married. And what else does Illinois say? That you can amend it or you can terminate it, but that has to be done in writing. Two important points to remember about any prenup is that you cannot include any terms related to your child support or parenting time or parenting responsibility with respect to your kids in a prenup agreement. That is just not enforceable in any state in the United States. So even if you include it, it will not be held enforceable at all, because those are governed by the state laws, and that is the only law that will ever govern that. So no matter what you say in your prenup, that's not going to be enforced. And then let's see. So we can talk about how can prenups be held unenforceable by different courts. And there are major criteria like any other contract act, right? If it is fraudulent, right? If somebody made you sign it under duress or emotional distress, and you can prove that, right? Just by saying is not enough. You are going to have to prove that's what happened to you. And that if the terms of the agreement are found as unfair or unconscionable to the court, and how court finds that, it's up to the court. If they find that certain terms are oppressive or very one-sided, and that the other party was disadvantaged, then the court might hold it unconscionable and may throw it out and not enforce it. So there are very limited, very narrow instances where court will not enforce it. So the majority is that the court is going to look at two adults willingly have entered into this contract, so we have to enforce it. That's going to be their first stance. So unless you can prove fraud, duress, emotional distress, or unconscionable terms, the court is not, going to consider those as their first instance. First instance is enforce it, and second is to look at this evidence that you present. Now, let me talk about, with domestic violence, we don't have to talk about the types of abuse, right? There are various types of abuse, and only one of which is economic abuse. So when you're talking about prenuptial agreements, we're mainly dealing with the finances and the property, mainly, or alimony, again, which is finances. But the types of abuse can be in so many ways, right? One can get abused just through sheer control, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, just sheer intimidation that only happens inside the four walls that nobody ever sees, but only you feel it. Isolation, verbal abuse, such as coercion, threats, just simply using male privilege, just because they think they are superior and you are a commodity, or you have to objectify women, just like it has been done for thousands of years. So that could be just a simply using their male privilege in an unfair way. Immigration abuse. And then lastly, economic abuse. So you have to think about now, when we analyze this question, can prenuptial agreements prevent domestic violence or abuse, right? So certainly, if I listed 12 categories of typical abuse, only one of 12 is economic, right? So maybe you can protect yourself financially through prenuptial agreement. What about the rest of rest of the other categories of the abuse. That's the behavior that how can prenup impact that behavior. In fact, as I said earlier, one of the cons of entering into a prenup with a wealthy spouse who may turn into an abuser later on is that he may be enabled to continue his behavior because now he's not afraid to lose his assets. So that's the one downside. But as earlier mentioned by Jayashri, right? By Jayashri, that you can have some protection built in there in the event so that you don't lose your assets and you may get some predetermined alimony amount that's mentioned in the prenup. But that's really about it, right? Because everything else related to a property division is governed by the state law. So if you don't have a prenup, and if you really still have a good lawyer representing you in your divorce, that lawyer should still be able to get the property division per the state laws. I mean, of course, if someone just sells all the properties fraudulently and leaves the country, there's very little U.S. courts can do. Then you'll have to take the matter to India. Let's say that person is now in India, then you'll have to file a case there to seize his assets there, or to capture him and bring him back here so that they can prosecute him in the US. But I mean, those are the only options in those cases, because otherwise, even without a prenup, if the person has assets here that can be considered as marital property, you have state laws to protect you, to get you the division of those marital assets, whether it's a car, a house, or life insurance policies, 401ks, savings, whatever. Everything is subject to division. And in fact, without a prenup, if there is domestic violence, you may, even with a good lawyer, you can always ask for all of it or most of it. And I have had many successful cases where we have been able to get a lot of the assets of the other side of the abusive spouse because of domestic violence. So in that case, I mean, I was lucky that I didn't have to deal with prenups there, because with a prenup, the court's hands will be tied and they'll have to follow a prenup. So that's that. Few other pros and cons I would like to cover here there are some other pros, like depending on the terms, how fair they are, how equitable they are. The abuser may be prevented from causing conditions that may force you to file a divorce, because in that case, if the prenup is in your favor, when I say your favor, victim's favor, and if the abuser knows that, like, okay, if the victim files for divorce, I'm about to lose 2/3 of my property because of the prenup, maybe that will prevent the abuser from continuing the abuse if the prenup is going to be in the victim's favor, which is such a rare instance, unfortunately. Yeah, which is a rare instance. And the other pro is that the abusive spouse may not be able to hide his assets. Because what happens, which is very common in most divorces of immigrant spouses that I have dealt with, that the abusive spouse ends up hiding his assets in India. What happens is most immigrant couples who are working here, living here in the US, tend to save their earnings and invest in property in India. And mostly the women are not thinking that it should be in my name also, and then the husbands are getting the property in their name or their parents' name. Because they are there and they have the power of attorney, right? You know how things work between here and India, and then they are left out. The money is both of their earnings, and it's invested in property that has no name of the spouse who's a victim of domestic violence. And then we have to do a lot more work on the legal side to reach those assets, to prove all of that. And then there is no record of bank transfers or any written records of how much the wife contributed and all of that. So that can be a real big issue. But here, if both the spouses are here, if there is no other country involved, then the abuser may not be able to hide his assets, because during the divorce property division phase, if you don't have an asset listed, let's say this person who had this property in India, if it was already mentioned in your prenup, then during the divorce time, they may not be able to hide it. That could be one thing. But it's there are so many ifs and buts here that really both parties have to be well aware of what all assets need to be listed, should be listed, inheritance, gifts, and everything else that is not jointly purchased. Let's see, another pro could be in terms of death, right? I think that's one area where I would always recommend, where, if a prenup was in place, it can save you a lot of headache, particularly if the spouse was married before. The spouse who dies, if he was married before and he has kids from prior marriage, then that could cause a lot of complications with respect to estate planning and division. So a prenup in that case, with a clearly laid out rights of the surviving spouse, can be helpful. But again, if you don't have a prenup, but if you have really clearly written will or estate plan, it does it serves the same purpose there. But if that wasn't there, but prenup was there with these terms, then prenup will be used by the probate courts to govern the terms. Let's see. Another pro is, of course, if a victim, right? If a victim spouse has significant assets and she's, of course, getting abused, and then she files for divorce, then she will be able to protect her assets through the terms of the prenup. But again, as I said, I've only seen that once in my 23 years. So the next one is, of course, if it is done right, the agreement, then it can save you a lot of legal fees if and when you go through a divorce proceeding, because property division probably is the longest and the most contested area of divorce. So if this is clearly laid out already in your prenup agreement, then that can save you a lot of legal fees during the divorce time, because the family courts will just have to follow the terms of the prenup and not have to reopen that discussion again. What are some of the cons in addition to the ones that I already mentioned? Is that very first con is that spousal abuse or a cheating by a spouse does not void or invalidate a prenuptial agreement. A lot of the time I get asked that question, but he was cheating, but he had, out of marriage relationships, and or domestic violence. How's that fair? We didn't think about that entering into prenup. Doesn't matter. None of that, unfortunately, invalidates the prenup. So, when you enter into a prenup, if you want to enter into a prenup, make sure you address these type of instances. Don't think badly that you have to talk about this. Like, what if somebody cheats? What if there is infidelity? What if there is domestic abuse by one spouse against another? Then what happens to the prenup? And it's good that you talk about it objectively before getting married and address it, because if it is clearly thought out and addressed properly and fairly in the prenup agreement, then of course the prenup agreement, will govern what happens. Does it terminate? Does it become invalid if one of those instances happen? But we're already talking about social cultural stigma of even thinking about prenup. Now imagine parties talking about these situations already, right, before getting married, because nobody wants to contemplate that this could end up in a domestic violence matter, right? But we should. As Jayashri mentioned, when we try to raise awareness among younger generation about thinking about prenups, we should also encourage them to think about such instances and then include those terms also. What happens? What happens you cheat? What happens you do that? But of course, it works both ways, right? So the downside of that is, if it is not clearly defined what is cheating, then the abusive spouse may come up with fake evidence, false evidence to prove that you've cheated. to invalidate the agreement, right? So there is always that downside and the risk, but that's why you need to clearly define these instances. And as I said, another con is that lack of economic independence is still one of the major causes, as we see in domestic violence arena, for victims to continue to survive domestic abuse and not leave the abuser. So since that has been one of the major causes as we see it, the prenups are mainly, if there are any, they're mainly done by the abusive spouse who ends up with substantive, more significant assets than the other spouse, and then it ends up being in his favor if there is a prenup. I mean, in those situations, I would rather not be presented with a prenup agreement so that we can go after all of his assets, as we have been able to do in other cases without a prenup, and get the most for the victim spouse.
Thank you so much, Reshma. I think this was a lot of information, but very useful information. And understanding the pros and cons will definitely help to all who are listening. And I think, Jayashree, you raised a very valid point to say it's more about awareness. Let that be there, and at least the new generation who's planning to get married, think of having one. You don't have to have, but you can think of it. So, Reshma, appreciate it. If there's someone who wants to reach you, Reshma, as a legal counsel, is there an information you can share? If there's a phone number of your office, or if there's an email address that you can share?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, when you earlier asked me to introduce myself, I just jumped right into my discussion. I was so excited to talk to all of you about it. So let me introduce myself. So my name is Reshma Sambare. I'm based in Michigan. I spend quite a bit of time between India and the US. My main practice is about commercial and transactional law, but I have been doing a lot of pro bono work in domestic violence, as I said, for almost 23 years. And in Michigan, I founded this organization called the South Asian Women's Association. It's mostly focused on domestic violence matters, sexual assault matters, and few other issues that are faced by South Asian communities. So everything that I do in the domestic violence arena is done either on a pro bono basis or through our nonprofit, because my other practice during the day that I do is mostly commercial laws. Anyway, so if you want to reach me, you can reach me via email, which is my first name dot last name, which is Reshma, RESHMA .Sambare, SAMBARE @gmail.com. Or you can call me also on my cell phone anytime, no worries. Promila has it, and it's 248-275-3653. So I'm here to help.
Okay, thanks so much, Reshma. Appreciate your time, and thank you, Jayashree, and to everyone who's listening to it to share their thoughts. We hope everyone who's listening can at least understand what it is, and it's your choice if you want to have it or not. But
yeah, I just have a few conclusive remarks, just as a recommendation.
Of course,
quickly,
absolutely, Reshma,
okay?
Please.
That so consider a prenup only if you yourself have assets to protect. Okay, that's the first thing. Only if you think that you are going to get a lot of inheritance or gifts and things, or you're going to have a lot of earnings, business, or what. Only if you have assets to protect, go for it. Don't just go if it is imbalanced. Make sure you have independent legal counsel. Make sure the terms, you understand it clearly. If it is English and English is not your first language, get it translated in your mother tongue. Make sure you understand the terms. Make sure it's in writing. Get witnesses to sign it, at least one each on both sides, and notarize it. Get it notarized. Make sure it's an official, legally valid document after you understand and agree with the terms. And then consider including appropriate language related to, as I said earlier, adultery, abuse, violence, right? So that your prenup can help you in those situations. That's it. Thank you again.
Thank you, Reshma. It was really very informative.
Good. Welcome. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angita. Thanks, Promila.